it is my pleasure to introduce Karlis Goldstein. Also, my apologies now to all the speakers for butchering their names with my German-English pronunciation. Amongst other things, he has worked for DJ Enner and was also a member of the cabinet for Commissioner for Energy Kadri Simpson. And recently, he joined the Estonian Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications, where he is the lead for international industry matters and decarbonization. He will give us a vision of the now and tomorrow of heating and cooling. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Goldstein.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for joining who are here today physically, and also to the people online. Indeed, I moved back to Estonia a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months almost, and my mission was to move from the political level and the European level to something on the ground. And I think that the Replace project is an example of precisely that, making a change on the ground. And when I was invited to speak here, of course, I made myself acquainted with the website, and I can warmly recommend the publications and the reports that are available there. They're really a treasure trove for those who want to look into replacing inefficient heating and cooling systems. As previously said, we didn't expect that we would find ourselves in the current context, geopolitically and also in terms of the energy transition. What can I say? I can say that everything happens for a reason, and this also applies to the Replace project, because if we were to only start now to think about the solutions, then we would have wasted a couple of good years. So I'm very grateful for the Replace project team for their effort, and it's indeed very, very timely to look into the results of their work. Let's look into maybe a more philosophical passage, however, with some concrete examples about the future of heating and cooling. So when I was contemplating today's event, I thought that in the essence, the foundation that we're trying to now negotiate in the Net Zero Industry Act, that we're discussing in the decarbonization of the industry plan, that we are trying to put in place in order to reduce the share of fossil fuels. It's really about using what we have. And something that, when I started my work back on energy efficiency about 6-7 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about how to value efficiency, because it wasn't obvious. Well, back then, fossil fuels were reliable, they were relatively cheap. Of course, people spent a big portion of their monthly earnings on energy, but still, despite that, there was a habit of knowing I might, save from a cup of coffee from Starbucks, but I'm still going to pay my 200 euro bill on energy every month. So we ended up in speaking that maybe the best type of energy is the energy that we do not use. So the energy that we save thanks to efficiency. And this is quite fundamental. Through Corona, we found out that it can be reduced through relatively drastic situations and measures, but still it has its limitations. So through behavior, I can relate to the Estonian example now. We saw that, for example, transport energy use reduced by 30% at a maximum, not on a year average, but on a maximum on a monthly scale, which means that under normal conditions, if you would rely only on behavioral change, what people are voluntarily willing to do, it's around 10, maybe 15%, speculating. So for the rest, to reach the rest, we really need to look at the technology, the building envelopes, the way that the system is structured. So just to give you a little bit of European context from my previous career, you've all probably heard about the European Green Deal. that the European Commission proposed under the Commissioner von der Leyen Commission. The idea of the work is to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. In order to get there, we need to reduce by 2030 already the greenhouse gas emissions by 55%, reach energy efficiency 13%, and increase the share of renewable energy in the energy system to 45%. And it's quite interesting to bring out the specific figure for heating and cooling sector. It has been doing better than the electricity sector. And you might ask why or how. I think the answer is quite obvious, because the statistics also accounts for biomass use. And a lot of the small residential energy consumption is basically wood-burning stoves, which are not necessarily the most efficient, which are not necessarily the best in terms of particulate matter emissions. But still, nevertheless, we have some, let's say, easy wins that we have reached in the heating and cooling sector, I would say, that are relatively cost economical and locally sourced. But the difficulty there is, what is the next step? If we recognize that it will be relatively difficult now to increase the share of renewable electricity through biomass combustion, then what are the alternatives? So it will probably need to be a different energy medium. Now, I also wanted to highlight the European figures for space heating. So space heating and hot water, this is mainly domestic consumption, is 27% of European energy consumption. Just to be clear, this is about the entire energy consumption, not specifically within the heating and cooling. So we're speaking about relatively big figures. It's more than 1/4. The other quarter goes to transport in EU, and not just residential, but everything else, freight including as well. So if we keep that in mind, then heating and cooling still dominates, even if we look at the subsectors, the energy consumption landscape. And of course, about 2/3 of the EU heating systems are inefficient. Now, everybody knows the Replace project. Here I would just like to bring or draw your attention to the two arrows that I have illustrated here on the slide. For me personally, I see that the biggest value of the Replace project is to bring trust for the market participants, for the municipalities, but also for the communities themselves. Because I know that there were a number of face-to-face meetings that were conducted within this project, and I think that we uncovered a set of, let's say, challenges that are there and are now more knowledgeable in approaching people face-to-face. And of course, the knowledge creation that I mentioned previously, that can be found on the project website. Now, when we speak about heating and cooling in this context, we're not focusing on industrial use of heat. We're speaking about residential use mainly. And first of all, the United Nations projects that there will be an increase globally in terms of urban dwellers. By 2050, it will be 68%. But also in the European Union, we see that current Eurostat figures state that 75% of the people live in the cities, and the European Commission estimates that by 2050 it will rise to 80%. So as you look at the map, we really need to solve the heating and cooling challenge for a large part of the geographical European Union. And it will touch upon a lot of communities, it will touch upon a lot of individuals, and if you have followed the negotiations of the Energy Performance for Buildings Directive, for example, you know that there are thousands of views about what energy efficiency levels are fair, how to reach them, how to realize them. This is a very personal problem. It's basically as personal as doing your shopping every day or what color you paint your living room. It's a very intimate question. So we need to also treat this issue with a lot of respect. So I wanted to present to you a couple of arguments on why we should at least look at efficiency and renewable energy gains in the heating and cooling. And the obvious big titles for me were security, savings, and possibly earnings. I'd say that as we move down that table, the security point is the most political one, something that I remember we discussed in trialogues of the Energy Efficiency Directive with the Dane rapporteur Ben Benson. However, when we move down to the earnings side, this is the part where probably the most work still remains. So could you bring the value to the individual level? Could the savings be rewarded? I think there's still a lot of work to be done there to try and monetize or estimate the benefits. But it can be calculated. I mean, if there were a goodwill, because any new generation requires, first of all, the installation of the generation capacity itself. It's very time-consuming. You need permits. You need to tackle not-in-my-backyard issues. But in the end, even if you manage to put in place the generation for heating and cooling for, let's say, an offshore wind park, you need to connect it to people. So you face a number of challenges in terms of infrastructure development and system costs. How about monetizing it and giving a reward to people for choosing not to increase the system cost? And of course, the delineation between individual and societal benefits here can be debated. This is completely arbitrary in my own creation. But the thought there is that basically you need to distinguish between the benefits for the individual and for the society. I didn't include all the wider benefits, of course. But a lot of the argumentation still remains very emotional. I think we need to create rationale why heating and cooling is a relevant topic. Here are a couple of vectors that heating and cooling touches upon, and I will just focus on a couple of them. These are the basic general development vectors that I see that are running through the heating and cooling debate. Of course, planning, and this is where it all starts, basically. Estonia is a good example again. In the Taltech University, some of us might know, there's a project on digital twins. So the buildings database is publicly available. They have created models around them by knowing when buildings have been constructed and on the data on their composition and recent renovations. You could estimate which buildings need to be upgraded or interfered with first. So you have an enormously useful tool for the municipalities that can help their administrations. And secondly, when you move on from that, there's a project on fluid dynamics, which interacts with an AI model in order to identify within the neighborhood renovation idea what are the most economical gains. So on a neighborhood level, the actual measures that you take might not be the same as on an individual building level. So the system benefits become more apparent. And of course, I'd like to mention the RES race, or the renewable energy race, because this is really that we're trying to face right now with the political challenges. So what do we need to do in terms of tapping into the potential of heating and cooling? And here, I think that the fairness angle is the most critical one if we look at individuals. For me, this incarnates the collaboration between the businesses, between the citizens, and between the municipalities. And of course, different level governance should support this through their own measures. And this is quite difficult because there's not always a given presumption of trust between all of the parties. For example, municipal governments and the utilities, or the individuals and the companies, or then between the citizens and the municipal governments and politicians themselves. So it really should sort of work together to provide the maximum of societal gain and benefit. Now, assuming that you have already resolved all the challenges and you're picking a project where to jump into, then there has been a lot of discussion about standardization, for example, about what is the definition of waste heat. And it's an open debate because on an EU level we say that waste heat is counted as a renewable energy source. So where could you get it from? You could get it either from industrial processes, from shopping centers in case there's no industry around in modern cities, data centers, and of course wastewater. But again, here, this means that you need to make a system that is very decentralized or very much data-driven so that you can tap into the individual heat sources without always relying on a central generation unit that would otherwise stand as a stranded asset. So I think that the big energy transition discussion is about managing risk. The key word is risk because for generations we have been used to doing things in a certain way. Now we need to become either more self-sustained or independent. So I didn't want to put on this slide which is which, but you can sort of think in terms of stereotypes, which is the fossil and which is the renewable. I think that we need to uncomplicate the complications. One possible definition of a risk is that it's a scenario in which losing something of value is probable. And the probability is always there, but we need to make sure that the probabilities don't materialize and that the perception is lower. So we still have a lot of stereotypes that we need to convert and trust that we need to build. And again, a Replace project, I think, is something very tangible in that sense. And I'm grateful for this addition to the debate. And now, before I round up, heating and cooling and the business case. So it's an interconnected cycle. It's a matrix. We cannot always rely on public support and grants. The entire energy transition will be very resource intense and heavy on the individuals if we require them to carry all the burden. And it will be difficult for each individual to take the steps towards renewable and efficient heating and cooling on their own. Try installing a heat pump in Brussels, for example. Not an easy task. I mean, you might need to get the actual quote from Denmark, the installer from Netherlands, getting somebody to install it locally and then fill it up yet again by the actual manufacturer. It takes a lot of hassle, so it hasn't been made convenient for many people. So this means that barriers remain even if the acceptance is high, if the awareness is high, if the economic rationale is there. We still need to build a business case. And this starts with the people from different angles. The people on the receiving end, of course. On the business side, the installers, for example, we are heavily dependent on the constraints, on the human resources side and skills. But I think above all starts with you, the ambassadors here in the room for heating and cooling, and the ambassadors following us online. So with this, I would like to say thanks for your attention.